discuss the difference between barrel aging and barrel fermenting. Today, we'll be putting that theory into practice, taste test and experiencing the difference for ourselves. If you did miss the talk in our last video about barrel fermenting and barrel aging beers, then go back and watch that. I will put a link somewhere here that will link back to that video in case you haven't seen it, which will give you some context. And if you want to know more about this beer in particular, Su Legno, the Su Legno Primo, there'll be a link in the description below. So to help us experience the difference between barrel fermented and barrel aged beers, I have these three beers here. Two of these are of my own creation from my homebrew, which I have aged in barrels. So the first is this one here. This is a Belgian style Lambic beer, which I did age in this barrel right here. So this one I bottled about 5 weeks ago and was aged in this barrel for about a year or so. I'm not actually really sure what the ABV of this is, so I did get quite a bit of evaporation from the barrel over that year, and so I estimate it is about 11% or so. However, it was difficult to tell exactly how much. The second beer I have is this Barleywine here, coming in at about 10%. So this one I bottled about 2 years ago, and it did spend about 5 months in this barrel here. So the Su Legno Primo is an amber style beer that has been barrel fermented and is about 6% and is described as being drinkable and approachable. So this should be a good way to compare and contrast the barrel fermented and barrel aged beers. And by the way, this also has got some nifty stuff on the back of the label here. So best after 15th of December 2023. Well, we are about 5 months past that, and this is from batch 3. Wow, as you can see there, that is quite a thick collar of foam. There's actually a slight tan colour of the foam actually. And that colour is like a bright orange amber. It's a little bit cloudy or hazy, but I don't think that's quite an issue. I think this actually looks like quite an appealing beer actually. There are slight hints of that oaky vanilla types of flavours that you do normally expect from beers that have been in barrels, but nowhere near the typical sorts of barrel-aged beers, or at least the ones I'll make at home anyway. And that aroma, it's almost notes of sweet fruit. It's like a sweet smell that's coming off it. It is subtle actually. It is a little bit subtle. You know, now that I do go in for another whiff or two, there might be this slight dank aroma. Possibly from the yeast. Not entirely sure, but it is reminiscent of sour barrel-aged beer or sour barrel beer, but it's not really sour though. But there's definitely this back hint of sweet, subtle fruity notes as well. It does have quite a good mouthfeel actually. It's not light, but it's not too heavy either. It is quite in that drinkable range. Yeah, there's hints of burnt fruit, not quite what you might get from amber beer that uses really caramelized malts. You know, not quite the burnt bitter fruit, but there is just hints of this dark fruit in there. Sweet dark fruit, rather than burnt. It's sweet dark fruit. There is this hint, this subtle, sweet fruity hint as well. Not almost like berries. But it is subtle, but it is there. Just as you take it in the mouth, you get that, dark fruit flavour, and then there's just this hint of this subtle, sweet, fruity flavour behind it.
In hindsight, this may have been more biscuit than berry. But anyway.
So the finish, it has a sort of moderate to high bitterness. I wouldn't call it's not a highly bitter beer, but it is not moderate. either. It's somewhere in between. So it's not quite your sort of 4% session beer sort of bitterness, but it is probably appropriate for the ABV value and the body that it has, and some of those subtle flavors. So it's a smooth, quite a smooth bitterness. It's not harsh, and it does linger softly on the tongue. I can also detect notes of that dark, sweet, fruity flavors lingering on the tongue as well. You know, you swallow the beer down, you've had that initial bitter hit after it's gone down, and then it sort of mellows away, and that lingering flavor, it is a little bit of that sweet, dark fruit, but what I think I detect is actually some of those flavors from the barrel. And I think that's what that sort of dank aroma that I was talking about before feels like. It is complexity from the barrel, because it is almost like those oaky and vanilla notes, almost like a red wine, but not quite as strong, but it reminds me of that, which is why I think that those dank notes I was thinking of is just that complexity of that barrel and vanilla flavor coming from this during fermentation, just expressing itself out of the beer. Okay, so this is a barley wine. We have a barrel-aged beer that we can now compare. One thing I must say about aging in a small barrel is that the surface area inside the barrel to the volume is a lot higher than if you use a bigger barrel. The way I understand it is that with the smaller barrels, they will intend to impart a bit more flavour on the beers than if fermenting in a larger barrel. So I am expecting the barrel character of this beer to be higher than what I would expect if aged in a commercial sized barrel, which tend to be a lot larger. That disclaimer out of the way, let's go in and see how this compares. So the main aromas I do get are that oak, vanilla, wood type aromas. And I do get that dankness I was talking about before. So I do think that is like a deep, rich aroma coming from the barrel. It does remind me of red wine a little bit. The flavour of this one does have a strong oak character to it. I would say that the dominant notes in the flavour are those oak barrel flavours. Well, I don't really drink red wine, but from my experience of drinking red wine, it does taste like a bitter red wine. Then on the aftertaste, there is some hot bitterness and almost like dark bitter fruit as well, which comes from the grain. But again, there is that lingering flavour of the oak and the vanilla. That's the last thing that I get. So once you swallow, that initial hit of the bitterness from the hops is gone, that's the remaining flavour that I get at the back of my throat. So in all, the oak and the barrel characteristics of this beer are a little bit more in your face than the previous one. As you can see, not a lot of head. So I still think it will provide an interesting insight. Oh, it smells almost like vinegar. The barrel fermented beers definitely do not smell like vinegar. It does overpower any of the oak character. Don't really get much character from the barrel. There's like a tiny hint, but predominantly it is that sour, vinegary smell. It is flat, doesn't help. But the main character is that sort of vinegary, acetic acid type of flavour. Sourness, and it's almost like a bit of a dank sourness. Not a bright sourness, not like a bright fruity sourness, it's like a low, danky sourness. If high and low sourness is a thing. Well, if it's not, it is now. You've seen it first here on JKB Brewing. Anyways, I digress. Except on the finish, it's got a bit of a weird finish. That initial sour hit in the finish, that lingering sensation is again some of that woodiness, but it is a little bit more dank this time than the previous two beers. I must say, tasting this again just at the end here, there is definitely this complex woody oak flavour. It's a bit more of a subtle complex woody oak flavour with some of that dark fruitiness. It is just so unique, something I've not had before, I must say. This is a really interesting beer and a really good beer. Actually, I'm thoroughly enjoying it, and it's not like anything I've had before. You know, 6%, it's not the biggest beer in the world, but it's not session strength, but it is quite complex and drinkable at the same time. It just does hit this really good spot. And yeah, it's full of complex, subtle flavours that you don't quite get from barrel-aged beers. In conclusion, what have we learnt from all of this? What can we tell about the actual experience of having a barrel-fermented beer versus a barrel-aged beer? I've hoped to have captured the two general types of barrel-aged beer you get. Now, I'm generalising here a lot, but we can't taste 1,000 beers at once, unfortunately. One thing about the barrel-aged beer, or this example here, is that the barrel flavours were a lot more obvious, and I don't think they were as complex as this beer. So I think with a beer like this, it's a lot more in your face, and so it is not quite as drinkable, and it is a lot higher ABV as well. If you're not into beers that are really in your face, then you're going to struggle to drink something like this. Now, of course, I do like this. I mean, I like all types of beers. Fortunately or unfortunately, haven't figured that out yet. Now, moving on to the sour beer. One thing that I have found across this example I've tried and some of the Belgian sort of inspired beers is that there's not as much oak flavour as say that, but again, it is more sourness. Now with this beer, the barrel-fermented beer, there's no sourness at all. The oak and the barrel flavour is not as in your face. It's a lot more complex. It is more subtle than the barrel-aged beer. And I do think some of those malt flavours do get to shine through a bit more in a beer like this. And of course, this beer is a lot more drinkable than these other two. So this one is a lot easier on the palate. These two beers, you need to be into those beers, I'd say. You need to like big beers that have big, bold flavours that are right in your face. I mean, definitely a sipping beer. This sour beer, you need to have that taste for sourness. So this is a much more rounded beer. This is more about getting all the different flavours, combining them and melding them together in a smooth fashion. These barrel-aged beers are more about highlighting on one particular point and showcasing that. Thanks for joining me on this tasting adventure here with the Su Legno Primo. Make sure to like, subscribe, and hit that bell notification because our journey with barrel-fermented beers is not over. No. We still have 2 more of these bad boys to go, so stay tuned in, and until the next one, keep exploring, tasting, and supporting those who make good and unique craft beer. Cheers!